Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Morris-Jumel Mansion's virtual parlor chat. We have the honor of sitting down with the Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society tonight. I'm just going to give a minute or two to let everybody, all the participants in, and then we will go ahead and start. Again, welcome to Morris-Jumel Mansion's virtual parlor chat for January. This month is Alexander Hamilton's birthday. So we have the Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society with us tonight. We are honored to have them. Give it another minute or so. Okay. So welcome everyone to Morris-Jumel Mansion's virtual parlor chat. We are thrilled to have our dear friends from the Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society joining us this evening. For those of you who are not familiar with the Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society, it did begin before the play. So tonight we have with us Nicole Scholet. She is the president, and she has an educational background in political science and economics. In addition to her work at the AHA Society, which she's been with since 2011, Nicole has worked for other history-focused entities, including the Historical Society of Newburgh Bay and the Highlands and Herzog Company, and serves as the assistant director of the Colonial Dames of America. Nicole also researches and speaks on the life of Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton. And please excuse me, that was my little Chihuahua Chucky who wants some recognition as well. And we also have joining us tonight, Sergio Villavicencio. Did I get that right, Sergio? I should know this already. Did I get it right? Close enough? Okay. So Sergio is the vice president of the Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society. And in addition to his work with the society in areas of communications, programming, and branding, Sergio is also a content engagement, diversity, and inclusion consultant to history-related entities and on the advisory council of the National Parks Conservation Association in the Northeast region. My name is Meg Lynch, and I am the Museum Experience Manager here at Morris-Jumel Mansion, and with me is my colleague Presley Rodriguez. She will be adeptly handling, she's our administrative coordinator and makes all the magic happen behind the scenes at Morris-Jumel, and she will be here to support you if you have any tech issues. So without further ado, I am going to go ahead and hand it over to our very capable and interesting friends here at the Society. So you guys can take it away.
Thank you, Meg. Well, it's truly such an honor to continue our long-standing partnership since 2011 with the Morris-Jumel Mansion. It's always amazing to connect with historic sites that have a relationship with Alexander Hamilton and sites that Hamilton himself had visited. So we love being able to promote that sort of tangential history. A little bit about the AHA Society, as Meg mentioned, we were founded in 2011 at a time where awareness was very important because many people didn't realize that Hamilton was an important founding father. And there really wasn't a national organization dedicated to educating about his life. So that was the creation of our society. And of course, since then, we've had the unprecedented popularity of a musical to now make Hamilton a household name, but there's always more to discover about Alexander Hamilton. So we continue to act as a educational resource for not only researchers, public institutions, but just every person that is interested in history to learn more and go more in depth about Hamilton's life, his legacy, his time period, and what it all means for us today. This event we're very excited to have as part of our annual Happy Birthday Hamilton umbrella. So we have many annual events every year, including events in January to commemorate the anniversary of Hamilton's birth. And so it's such a pleasure to be here with you today. And with that, I'll turn it over to Sergio to add anything he'd like to say about our society or about this evening's chat that we have planned for you.
We're really happy to be working again with the Morris-Jumel Mansion. We have been collaborating with them for a number of years, and it's always a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. And we're really excited today. I think we have a good mix of attendees that know a lot about Hamilton, maybe don't know a lot about Hamilton. And so our goal today is to really provide a general overview. And so we'll be going a little bit more just going through his entire life in little snippets, and we do welcome a robust Q&A session. So we welcome lots of questions, and as we touch briefly, because he lived such a fascinating and varied and jam-packed life, if there's any topic that we touch on that you have a question about or would love for us to deep dive more, we're certainly happy to do so. So with that, I will turn it over to Sergio to cover the first part of his life, which was his youth in the Caribbean. Sergio, do you want to talk a little bit about the early part of his life there?
Absolutely. The story of Hamilton is a story of three islands in the Caribbean at the beginning of his life. But we all know that he was born in Nevis, which is a 36 square mile island in the Caribbean. At one point, it was called the Queen of the Caribbean. It's a wonderful place. And when Alexander Hamilton was born, it was owned by the British. And so Alexander Hamilton's upbringing started there. Eventually, later in his life, a few years later, he and his family moved to the Dutch island of Sint Eustatius, which was a Dutch island. And then after a few more years, he moved to St. Croix, which was a Danish island. And it is very interesting to know that these were three different islands, three different nations, three different mentalities. And the Caribbean itself had a mindset of its own. It was a fast-paced place where everything happened rather quickly. You would see how important those islands were, that these powers kept on trying to grab them from each other all the time. And the prospect of war was just around the corner. This place was constantly at the mercy of the weather, at the mercy of wars, at the mercy of a number of things. And so people had to do the best out of it as fast as possible. And that is something that you can see later in his life. When he was, the musical says he was writing like he was running out of time. You see the efficiency and the amount of documents that Hamilton produced throughout his lifetime, and how much and efficiently and as fast as possible he was trying to get things done. That is definitely something that came from his upbringing. It is also important to note that a lot of the things that Alexander Hamilton was able to contribute to the formation and solidification of the United States of America as a country also had a lot of influence during his formative years in the Caribbean. When he was around 14 years old, Alexander Hamilton was working as a Caribbean clerk at an import-export company of Bickman and Kruger. And his boss fell ill. And so 14-year-old Alexander Hamilton was in charge of the whole company for a number of months. Now, it is important for you to notice that we're talking about a child here. But try to imagine for a second the kind of character and the kind of personality and all the skills, the social skills that he had to build in order to be able at that age to deal with seasoned captains and sailors who were coming from weeks at the ocean and wanted nothing but to get off the ship and go take some rest inland. Being able to do all that, Alexander Hamilton had to continuously grow his character, his personality, and that is, again, something that we continue to see throughout his life. It was during this time, the formative years, in which Alexander Hamilton was exposed to things like credit, the value of a standard, commerce, finances, the value of a strong currency, maritime commerce, and so on. Things that he would later use, for example, when he established the what later became the U.S. Coast Guard, and also the concept of credit and currency when he was Secretary of the Treasury later on in his life. It's a wonderful thing to dive into the aspects of his formative years, and here I would like to mention an interesting book, probably one of the best books out there about Alexander Hamilton that people can find, is The Formative Years by Michael E. Newton, which I will put in the chat. Nicole, would you like to add something?
Absolutely. What's really fascinating about Hamilton's life is that because he had this experience between the 3 different islands, he also learned about those different international identities, and then also that he's had so many family members spread throughout these islands, that his formative years also had a lot of uncertainty and instability in that sense. The letter behind me actually is a letter that he wrote to one of his best friends, Ned Stevens. The Stevens family actually took in Alexander and likely his brother once the father had left the island, likely for work. The mother had passed away. A cousin had committed suicide, as the musical talks about, but also all their grandparents and much of their aunts and uncles passed away within just a short 1 to 2 year time frame. So at this point, they were essentially orphaned and living with not even relatives, but friends at this point. And so in this letter, he talks about, to his friend who was studying up at what today we know as Columbia University, saying to that friend, that I contempt my condition to which my fortune condemns me, working as a clerk. I want to find a way to make something more of my life. And I hope that there can be a war so that I can essentially prove myself, my valor, and, recognizing that at the time in the 18th century, someone with no connections, no fortune, no money was really the only way he'd be able to make a name for himself. And so we'll see that when he emigrates to the mainland US and the pivot that his life takes as a result.
If I
Is
may
there anything
add,
you wanted to add about the Caribbean? Yes.
Yes, I think it is also important to know that how Alexander Hamilton's life experiences as a Caribbean clerk were different from someone who would be working and trading in the mainland. Just to illustrate the shock of mentalities between what Hamilton was used to and what he found when coming to the United States, what later would become the United States. The Caribbean had a trading and manufacturing mindset, while the United States, the mainland colonies of Britain later to become the United States, had an agrarian mentality. An agrarian man was the ideal. And most of the founding fathers that we can see were supportive or involved with that mentality.
Absolutely.
I just want
Absolutely.
to add that I think it's really fascinating the way that you draw the parallels between, what went on within his early life and how that sets the stage for, what we commonly know Hamilton for today. I think that's really powerful and a perspective that not everyone leans into.
I think that we see, as Sergio was talking about, the mentality of the founders locally how that influenced them, and then for Hamilton to speak multiple languages, come across so much diverse ways of thinking, but then also be so much more exposed to commerce, be so much more exposed to manufacturing and the realities of international trade than most of the other founding fathers at the time of the forming of the Constitution. It just really gave him such a different perspective than everyone else. And so I think that's one of the real key differentiators that made him think so differently than some of his fellow politicians at the time. So just that time period of his life, just to give a little bit more context, we don't know when Alexander Hamilton was born. There's been a long-standing debate between 1755 and 1757 for the last century or so. He, according in his lifetime, it was known as 757. And research by Michael E. Newton suggests it might even be as early as 1754 based on newly discovered documents. So we commemorate on January 11th, but we don't know the year. So that's always a little bit tricky when you're talking about history. But it was in 1772 when Alexander Hamilton emigrated to the mainland colonies in what today is the United States. There's a lot of narratives about how he ended up there, but latest research suggests that it was actually a cousin that provided the funds, and he was able to go up first briefly in New York City with Hercules Mulligan, that everyone now knows that name from the musical. But then he did preparatory school in New Jersey. That was a feeder school for what is today Princeton. But Hamilton always wanted to get ahead as quickly as he could, and so he wanted to go to a school that would allow him to do an accelerated course of study. So he ended up back in New York City at King's College, and he originally was studying medicine, but he switched to law eventually. And he also paid for a private tutor himself to teach him mathematics to be able to learn artillery work. Keep in mind, this is 1772 to 1775 period as he's in school, and tensions are building, hostilities are building. He is a young collegiate, but he is actually engaging in major essay writing with some of the leading thinkers in public debate at the time, and making an anonymous name for himself. But many of the leading thinkers at the time that were reading his pamphlets were thinking it was, one of the much more well-known political thinkers. And so he really was jumping into debates already while he was in school. And when hostilities broke out at Lexington and Concord, he quickly joined a militia group called the Hearts of Oak, was beginning training there. And then again, because Hamilton was already always thinking ahead, if the letter that's behind me, he wanted to make way and plan for futurity, that he took that schooling that he himself had paid for, of learning how to all the calculated angles and complicated mathematics that went into becoming an artillery officer, that he was soon appointed by New York State to be a captain of New York Artillery. So it was quite remarkable for someone that, didn't have a lot of local connections. Again, especially when we're talking about this time period, for him to receive a rank of captain and to be leading other men at such a young age and in such a complicated part of the military really speaks volumes to how prepared he was for that. And he quickly made a name for himself in the 1776 campaign. So he fought in several battles, and he came to the attention of a lot of the major generals. And it was on March 1st, 1777, that he was officially appointed as aide-de-camp to George Washington to become a part of his staff of his military secretaries. And again, even there, Hamilton really distinguished himself. So not only was he a traditional aide-de-camp where he helped write letters on Washington's behalf, but he really went above and beyond. He coordinated his own spy rings, collected intelligence on behalf of Washington, assisted in planning strategy, would ride out to the field and carry out orders, was sent on private missions in Washington's name to deal with other generals, requisition troops, would accompany Washington to put out skirmishes and mutinies of troops that weren't being paid. And so for 4 years, they really worked side by side in very intense conditions through very difficult, as we know at Valley Forge, where the men were, leaving bloody footprints in the snow, to battles where they were dying of heat stroke and really all the extremes in between. So that was a very intensive 4 years. But also Hamilton saw that while he was in this inner circle and meeting many of the leading men of the day, it was not only a grueling job, a job which many other aides-de-camp cycled out and regularly went back to the field, but Hamilton had proved himself so valuable to Washington that he was really kept in that position much longer than others, until finally Hamilton really put his foot down and said, I want to go back in the field. I want to make sure I make a reputation and name for myself, which again, going back to the letter behind me, he knew was important for whatever was coming after the war, for people to know his name, to respect him as a man of valor, to value him as a potential future public figure. And so it was just shortly before the Battle of Yorktown campaign that Hamilton was finally granted a command in the field again. And he was immediately established quite the reputation in leading the charge on Redoubt number 10, which was a key fortification for the British at Yorktown. And once the redoubt fell in conjunction with a sneak attack with the French on Redoubt 9, a few days later, Yorktown was taken, and that was the last major battle of the Revolutionary War. And so with that, Hamilton again was ready to pivot and look to the next phase of his life. And that's when he not only was starting out to build a family himself, but also looking to what was his next step, and that was studying law. Sergio, did you want to share anything else related to the Revolutionary War time period?
Yes, I believe he got his rank of colonel in Yorktown, correct?
It was post-dated that he was lieutenant colonel and later colonel, so dates are a little tricky, but yes.
If I might interject, just because this is a Morris-Jumel hosted event. So Aaron Burr was aide-de-camp to General Putnam during the time that Washington, so for those of you who don't know, George Washington used Morris-Jumel Mansion as a headquarters during the, sorry if you're hearing honking, New York City. So George Washington used the mansion as headquarters during the American Revolution. While Hamilton would have been with the army, he would not have been inside the house. Aaron Burr may have been inside the house because he would have been, sitting in on those meetings and taking notes. But Hamilton very likely was on the property at some point. Granted, the property was significantly larger than the 1.5 acre that we see today. It ran, approximately river to river, about 145th Street to about 170th Street. So a pretty huge slice of land. So that's the first time that Hamilton comes to visit Morris-Jumel. Sorry, I couldn't resist.
No, and I love that you brought that up, because that can sometimes get missed, and we'll tie it back in with Hamilton's later history with the house when he's more of a public figure. So that's just great. Thank you, Meg. Then the next phase of his life, and again, there's a lot of focus on his revolutionary service, but there's so much that he did after that that often doesn't necessarily get to be a part of the narrative. So between 1782 and 1786, I sort of define this period of his time as lawyer and public man. So he's really starting out in his law career, thanks to a special provision that New York State waived the requirement of 3 years of studying before a lawyer could pass the bar. Hamilton was able to self-study and pass the bar in 6 months and quickly take on a legal practice as he went about establishing a family with his wife, Elizabeth Schuyler, who he had just married in December of 1780. Her father, Philip Schuyler, was not only an important general during the war, but then also one of the leading figures in New York society, the Schuylers and the Livingstons, and they're all interconnected. So with this marriage, Hamilton really then became even more connected with the New York society. And so it's quite a leap from where he was in the Caribbean without a lot of connections to where he quickly became in just a few years. It's really remarkable. But again, that didn't stop him. He didn't become complacent. He just kept looking forward. And we really see in this time period how much not only his experiences in the Caribbean, but how much his experiences during the Revolutionary War affected him and shaped his way of thinking. So early on as a lawyer, even though he was very obviously on the side of the revolution's side, he also was very much in favor of rule of law. And so when New York State passed a law that went in direct contradiction to what the Treaty of Paris discussed regarding property seized during the Revolutionary War, Hamilton was not afraid to be on the side, the unpopular side, and he took on dozens and dozens of cases on behalf of loyalists to defend them against this law that New York State had passed, believing it was unfair to penalize them in how their property was being used. So it's really quite remarkable that the first foray into his legal career, he's ready to take so bold a stance and willing to be unpopular for something that he thinks is right. And you know, his vision and his arguments helped then shape this concept of judicial review, and that his belief that national law, or this law that was passed for all the states, should supersede state law, and that law that New York State passed shouldn't have been passed. And so that was quite remarkable. He also took on a lot of different public roles. So he was appointed New York Receiver of Taxes during the Revolutionary War. He already saw from an inside view how difficult it was for George Washington to have enough funds to pay his military troops. We saw multiple counts of Hamilton riding with Washington to put down, as I said, mutinies of soldiers that hadn't been paid in years and were receiving empty promises. And so this affected Hamilton not only personally, but then also on behalf of his fellow soldier that he always wanted to look out for. And so we also see that in his role, where he's now in charge for all of New York State to try to requisition these taxes from New York State legislature, but not really having any authority on behalf of the federal government to actually get those funds that are needed to run the entire federal government. You know, there are costs that are associated with running government. And so again, he was experiencing those difficulties, and this all fueled his thinking into what the government on a federal level should be. And so we see at this time period, before the Constitutional Convention is ever held, years before, he's already writing these incredible political treaties of and trying to work through governments to make a call to amend the Articles of Confederation, make the federal government stronger, give it some teeth, let it be able to collect money to actually operate and function. So it's really amazing. He served as congressman on behalf of New York State during this time period. He also served in the New York Assembly. And then he was involved in establishing a lot of organizations on a level in New York State. So we see that he was involved with the Society of Cincinnati, which was a fraternal organization established for officers of the Revolution. They did a lot of things, but they even one of their main things was to look out for fellow officers. So make sure they got pensions, look out for family members of you know, maybe a soldier passed, and help take care of the family, look out for them. There's a lot of things that he did, and he remained very involved with that group for the rest of his life. He also helped establish the New York Manumission Society, which was not only promoting the abolition of slavery or gradual emancipation of slavery, but also looking out for welfare of both freed and enslaved Black individuals. And so they did a lot of things, such as establishing a school system, the first non-denominational school system, to help educate for free children of both enslaved and freed Blacks in New York State. And that had a remarkable impact. He was involved in the founding of the Bank of New York. So again, you just really see all these civic institutions, institutional structures, political structures. He's involved in it all while he's building his law practice. And so with that, we then are looking at the period in which he really becomes heavily involved with creating a new federal government. And so the time period 1786 to 1789, where he's a constitutional advocate, I'll turn over to Sergio to really dive into that.
Thank you. I would actually like to go a little bit back in time and mention about the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation were the written document that established the functions of the national government following the Declaration of Independence. And it was really good for a while, but after a little bit of time, it was clear that it had some strong flaws. Among those, the Articles of Confederation, the government that we had before, what is currently the type of government that rules the United States, did not have a lot of powers. Among the powers that did not have, they did not have any power to regulate foreign policy or commerce. They did not have the power to raise an army. They did not have the power to collect taxes. They did not have the power to do anything unless every single state actually was in unanimous agreement with whatever they needed to have. Think about it. If one single state said no or disagreed, nothing could be done. And you can see things like this, like, for example, in the proposed impost that started in 1981, again, a way of trying to get the central government, Congress at the time.
1781, right?
What did I say?
1981. I know we always mix up the decades. We're
That's
talking
right.
about 1980s. We'll talk about 1780s.
I
Yeah.
was just 200 years off, not a big deal. I apologize. Anyway, 1781, the impulse was proposed as a way to start collecting money for the government, and one state said no. They kept on going. On 83, I believe they tried again with even less with even less asking, and it was again rejected. So you can start to see how that was not going to be sustainable for the government of this nation. And one thing that is very interesting about Alexander Hamilton being an immigrant is that he was not born here in the States, and therefore he did not have the state loyalties that a number of the founding fathers at the time had. And you can see Thomas Jefferson, for example, considered himself Virginian first and American second. A number of the founding fathers were very loyal to their own states. And just think about it for a second. Let's make a little experiment. Imagine that someone in South America says, you know what, let's make a superpower. Let's make a single country here. The most powerful countries will want to be in a more advantageous position. And you can see, let's go to a different example. That was a poor one, but something concrete. Look at what England did with the European Union. They were able to keep the pound as their currency. And that is something that it's logical when you have some nations, or in this case, states that are more powerful to others. They will look for their own interests and try to be in a more advantageous position. Something that is very interesting is that in hindsight, a lot of people try to think of this critical period, like some historians called it, as a time in which everybody was holding hands, singing Kumbaya, and everybody was agreeing absolutely in every single thing. But for a period of time, there was nothing united about the United States of America. Some had a stronger influence, a stronger wealth, a stronger armies, and even some of them had their own treaties with Europe. There was no unified currency. And so even when they wanted to do some commerce between them, that was a whole tricky thing. And as I mentioned earlier, the Articles of Confederation was not able to properly regulate commerce. So more things happened, and among one of them was Shays' Rebellion. We will write it on the chat. Those who are not familiar, please look it up. It's very interesting. But basically, in the north, there was an uprising because the governor decided to put really strong taxes and actually collect some back taxes. And so, again, the central government was not exactly there with the power to regulate anything like that. And so when there was this armed insurrection, there was no national army to actually go and placate that situation. So it was very clear that things were starting to show the flaws. Even George Washington himself was not happy with the Articles of Confederation. In one of his correspondence, he said something has to happen. So what happened then? Alexander Hamilton saw an opportunity in one national meeting that was called the Annapolis Convention. And the purpose of the Annapolis Convention was to determine and regulate certain things regarding commerce between the states. Alexander Hamilton seized the opportunity and called for a different kind of convention, one to happen the next year. We're talking about a month, a few weeks after the Shays Rebellion. And he called for the Constitutional Convention. At the time, it was called the Philadelphia Convention, not the Constitutional Convention. And the purpose of this convention was to revise the Articles of Confederation. But as you can see in history, a lot of the delegates who went there had a little bit more in mind than just revising. And the reality was that a whole new system of government was created, which is the system of government that exists today. Central government, and based on a strong document called the United States Constitution. Is there anything you would like to add so far, Nicole?
No, I think that there's so much in this topic to cover. Of course, there's the Constitutional Convention, then there was the ratification process itself, which Hamilton was very heavily involved with. So I think if we want to just touch on that before we jump on to his time as Secretary of Treasury.
Yes. So Alexander Hamilton was a New Yorker, and he immediately wanted to be, he called for the Constitutional Convention, so he obviously wanted to be part of the delegation. A couple of things for you to review on your free time, and I'm writing it right now. Alexander Hamilton, as a New Yorker, was supportive of the Constitutional Convention and creating a new form of government, but his state didn't necessarily back him up. Why? Clinton was the governor of New York, and he was getting a tax that was very generous with the state, and so there was no reason for him to. Sorry, I'm going ahead into the ratification. Let me backpedal a little bit. So Hamilton actually asked for 5 delegates to be sent in total to the Constitutional Convention, and he only got 3. Now this is tricky because the other 2 were not in favor of doing anything else but revising the Articles of Confederation. So when the Constitutional Convention happened, all the voting of absolutely everything were done by delegation, not by individuals. And therefore, Hamilton was outvoted every single time, 2-1. In a nutshell, New York voted no to absolutely everything. And that frustrated Alexander Hamilton a lot, obviously. Now, Hamilton, being known as the most ardent supporter of the Constitution, was not able to make a difference. And so he left. Very soon, the other 2 delegates left too. And after a while, Hamilton came back. Now, please bear with me for a moment, but I really need to tell you the narrative of this because this is amazing. When Hamilton came back, he did not come back in a delegation. He came back as an individual. And he was able to participate in all the latest, the last days of discussion of the Constitutional Convention. And he was even part of the Committee of Silent Arrangement that ended up producing the most important documents, the Constitution itself, the 2 resolutions for ratification, and what is known as the cover letter of the Constitution. If you don't know what the cover letter of the Constitution is, look it up because it is fantastic. I just shared a website. It is a fantastic website that can give you a lot more insight into everything that happened at this time. And the reason why I said that Hamilton came back as an individual is because when you see the writings of George Washington writes that the Constitution was unanimously approved by such and such and such a state, and Colonel Hamilton from New York.
Absolutely. And so this is one of Sergio's really amazing areas of research, and he's making so many incredible discoveries in the last year in partnership with some of his research partners. And as he mentioned, statutesandstories.com has a lot more about some of the incredible archival materials they have found and the narratives that are being reshaped about this entire, not only Constitutional Convention, but then the ratification process. So there's so much more, as you can see, to dive down into each of these topics, but I do want to jump ahead to his time as Secretary of Treasury, because that was also such a seminal part of his life. He was appointed as first Secretary of the Treasury under George Washington's first term in 1789. September 11th, 1789 was his first day in office. And during this period, he completely shaped this department and really went above and beyond just shaping the department, but really recommending and proposing his vision for an entire economic system for the United States to make it strong, to make it dependable, to make it secure. And he really thought about it for every angle. So we see him writing major reports to Congress to suggest legislation for them to approve. He created the report that established the US Mint and spent an incredible amount of time researching and detailing what national currency that he thought the country should have, how to fund the debt that we were still carrying from the Revolutionary War at the federal level, and then also the states that were burdened with their own debt, and how to create a system that would harness that debt and allow the country to move forward in a financially and fiscally responsible way. He helped establish presidential protocol for Washington and how presidents moving forward should interact with foreign dignitaries, with the legislatures themselves, with constituents, all these level of detail that we don't realize had to be discussed and decided at that time. He proposed and established a national bank of the United States that would help maintain that stability and provide funding in a way to process the debt instruments that were being funded by the government to process that Revolutionary War debt and fund the government. He also envisioned that the future of the country would be more in manufacturing, not only to maintain a independence from other countries, a dependence on other countries for foreign materials, but then also to enhance economic opportunities for Americans. And so he proposed not only a report to Congress, but then on his own worked to establish and fund the Society for Useful Manufacturers, which funded the first planned industrial city in Paterson, New Jersey. He also, just before the end of his life, co-founded Jersey City, that he also envisioned would be an incredible manufacturing center. He also established what today we know as the U.S. Coast Guard to not only help protect and oversee revenue within the revenue service that he also set up, but then to counteract smuggling, which again, going back to his time in the Caribbean, going back to his experience in the Revolutionary War, where smuggling was a patriotic duty, he now had to pivot and find ways to make sure that the federal government was being funded, which at the time was 95% through tariffs of goods being imported into the country. So there's just such a breadth of things that he did during his 5+ years tenure as Secretary of the Treasury. But in 1795, he felt like he had largely set up his system in place. And keep in mind, he wasn't like a lot of other founding fathers that had plantations or other forms of wealth that would continue generating funds for him while he was in public service. He didn't have much to his name, and he was a lawyer by trade. So by 1795, he was ready to retire at the time from public life and return to his legal practice to continue supporting his growing family at the time. And so we see during this time, 1795 to 1798, he's again a very prominent lawyer, but would still be very active and respected on the political level, especially of asking advice and opinions on everything that was going on, giving a lot of advice to, and that actually was frustrating for President Adams at the time, that so many of his own ministers would turn to Hamilton for advice. So Hamilton remained influential while he was out of the public sphere technically, but he was called back to support the federal government, for example, in the first case that tested the constitutionality of a law. Instead of the Attorney General arguing that case, the US government decided to hire Alexander Hamilton as its lawyer, argue and defend a law that Hamilton himself had helped write, that proposed a tax on carriages, a luxury tax. And so Hamilton came and successfully argued that. So many people know of Marbury versus Madison in 1803, which was the first time a law was considered unconstitutional. But I think it's quite remarkable that Hamilton was brought in to prove the constitutionality of a law, the first test of that. In 1798, Hamilton once again was, yes, please jump in, Meg.
I just want to mention that in 1790, during his tenure as Secretary of the Treasury, Washington was doing what we lovingly refer to as a revolutionary victory lap, visiting some of the hot spots of the American Revolution, including, Old Fort Washington, which is in Bennett Park, and he also visited the mansion. So there was a dinner held. Some believe it was held inside the dining room. Others who are more familiar with the size of these men suggest that it would have been in the octagonal room, which is quite larger. And then others suggest that, and those of us who have worked in the House for years and know what July in the House feels like, suggest that it was probably hosted on the North Lawn al fresco. So Hamilton was with Washington, and so was John Adams, Abigail Adams, Eliza Hamilton, Henry Knox, Lucy Knox, Thomas Jefferson, the whole crew. Can't miss an opportunity to tie this back to the mansion.
Yes, I'm so glad that you reminded us, Meg, as we're trying to fit in so much information, because that was such a monumental time where not only, as you say, it was looking back on, they decided to visit the ruins of some Revolutionary War fortifications and just reflect on how far they had come, but then it was really the first time that the quote unquote cabinet ministers had come together in a social function. So some refer to it as the first cabinet dinner, but it was quite remarkable to have both the men and their wives there. Besides Jefferson wasn't there at the time, but it really is a monumental part in history, and that took place at Morris-Jumel Mansion. So thank you for making sure we didn't miss that as part of that time period of the Washington's presidency.
Of course.
So jumping back into 1798, when Hamilton was once again brought into public service, and speaking of war, the US was getting into a conflict that was growing even more intensely with France. Some of you might have heard the XYZ affair, and this was turned into what is known as the quasi-war. So it was largely an undeclared naval war, but there were many battles on the seas, and then the US was also preparing to go to war by building back up the military, which had been completely defunded and dismantled after the Revolutionary War. And so when we looked like we were on the precipice of going to official war, what's really amazing is two things. One, that General Washington was asked to once again head the troops, and Washington said he would on two conditions. One, that he would not fight until there was actual land battles, and two, that he would get to name his those in command under him that would be in charge of those preparations. And Washington completely disregarded typical military protocol and named Alexander Hamilton as his inspector general, as his number two in command. And so it was actually up to Hamilton to completely rebuild the army. He was building up encampments, looking up troops, getting troops in order, getting them trained, preparing a navy. Again, we had no navy. And so what were the first ships that formed the navy? Were the cutters, the Coast Guard cutters that Hamilton had created during his time as Secretary of Treasury. That became our first navy. And then he again was requisitioning additional ships to build. And so this is an incredibly huge part of his life that, in my opinion, is really disregarded for how monumental it is, that he truly to my opinion, can be considered a founder of the U.S. Army, the U.S. Navy, because if you look at their start dates, a lot of them will say 1798, because it's been essentially continuous since then. And so it was really Hamilton does not get enough credit for what he did to reestablish those armed forces and influence them. So I find that quite remarkable. And then when General Washington passed away in 1799, Hamilton himself became the major general of the entire army. And so that to me is really quite remarkable, and I think doesn't get enough attention. When that war was settled diplomatically, the quasi-war was settled diplomatically, Hamilton once again essentially returned to his legal practice. And so in the last 4 years of his life, between 1800 and 1804, we see him once again practicing law. But then there's also a lot of tragedy that marks the last years of his life. Several of his in-laws pass, and that was quite tragic. Of course, the passing of his eldest son, Philip, in a duel defending his father's honor, just absolutely broke the hearts of the entire Hamilton family. That was very difficult for not only Alexander, but the entire family to recover from. It was during this time that Alexander Hamilton was really finally establishing a country seat, if you will, as many of the other prominent founding fathers did, with building an estate in what today is Upper Manhattan. At the time was in the middle farm country, and he especially did that for his wife, her having been from such a pastoral area and loving flowers and loving being out in nature. I think it was not only for her, but then also to show his social prominence that he was able to build that kind of estate. We, as I said, still see him continuing his vision on manufacturing with the establishment of Jersey City just a few months before his death. More incredible legal precedents, including the 1804 decision of People versus Croswell. What's quite amazing is because we inherited so much of British law, there were things like libel, that if something was published about a public figure that was negative, even if it was true, if it was negative, the writer could still be jailed, fined, imprisoned. And so that was just something that we had inherited. And Hamilton took on a case and argued that truth, if what is published is true, even if it's negative, that the truth should be a defense against libel. And so that case was argued, and his arguments were eventually brought into New York law, and we live with that precedent today. But can you imagine if we didn't? Again, all these little nuggets that you don't even have time to cover in his life because there's so much else to talk about. And then we see on July 11th, 1804, that there's a conflict that largely results from political differences that blow up and becomes an affair of honor, or what we today know as a duel, between Vice President Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton. They met on the dueling grounds of Weehawken, New Jersey, and Alexander Hamilton was fatally wounded and passed away the next day. So where does that leave us now, all these years later, 210 plus years later, when we're talking about Hamilton's legacy? Well, what's really interesting is because he was one of the first founding fathers to pass away, he easily became a scapegoat for many of the other founding fathers. He already had a bit of a rocky reputation at the time of his death because of a very public affair that went to public knowledge, and then also political infighting with publications talking poorly about his own political allies going public. So there was already controversy at the end of his life, but we see that history was easily rewritten, and things that were unpopular were easily blamed on him that he had nothing to do with. And so that's a very interesting part of the historical record. And we see there's an actually really fascinating book by Stephen Knott called The Persistence of Myth. And it talks about how Hamilton's reputation and public perception has waned so much with the changing political viewpoints over the last 200 years. And that's really something that our society really talks about, is trying to present the truth in a more factual, straightforward way. And to talk about the real historical record and learn more from that. But there's so many other things that we could talk about Hamilton's legacy. There's a lot that left to point to just looking around us today, our monetary system, our legal system, our political system, how much of that was touched by one individual. It's so remarkable. The skyline that we see here in New York City, how much of that can we look to Alexander Hamilton and really attribute to his vision, his dedication, his hard work, everything that he really created on behalf of this country. It's just amazing. We see his legacy in the things that we hold every day, money. So not only is he on the $10 bill today, but he, fun fact, has been on more denominations of currency than any other person. And he just, rightfully belongs there for all that he did for our financial system. And now in 2022, to see what a art form such as a musical can do for a public figure, a forgotten historical figure, and not only talk about his life, but why this individual and why learning about this time period is so important for us, and how we can connect to these historical figures as individuals on a personal level, and to see people reconnect with history in a true and engaged way is really exciting for us. And so we're here to talk about this legacy and talk about the many ways that we can continue to learn, continue to understand, because without knowing why our systems are the way they are, because of individuals like Hamilton who helped contribute to their creation and what went in their minds to create these systems, it helps us be better informed about what we're interacting with on our daily lives. So with that, I'll turn it over to Sergio for any of his last remarks on Hamilton's legacy as well.
I just wanted to mention something that is very remarkable, which is the Federalist Papers are still being used as the de facto interpretation of the Constitution all these years later. And Megan, can you mention something about the musical and the Morris-Jumel mansion?
Oh, you're just muted, Megan.
Sorry about that. Thank you. So obviously, many people knew about Hamilton prior to the musical, but that has he's definitely gone viral, if you will. And I think that, if Hamilton lived in this time, he would be going viral all the time. But when Lin-Manuel Miranda was doing his research for the play, he actually spent some time at the mansion. So he connected with the executive director at the time, and he actually wrote parts of the play here in the mansion. So what you see in front of you right now is Aaron Burr's bedchamber, or our interpretation of it. And here is Lynn sitting in a chair that did not belong to Burr, which is the only reason we were able to allow Lynn to actually sit in it. But he spent some time channeling the ghost of Aaron Burr, kind of trying to absorb some of that inspiration in this space, and the songs that he wrote in the space where Burr's Elements of My Shot, The Room Where It Happens, and I believe there's one other song that had some Burr elements. So it's really fascinating that, a musical can result in revival of historic figures that had been forgotten or lost or not fully acknowledged in the ways in which, you know, Hamilton obviously deserves. So we are very grateful for Lynn. Of course, you can also see George Washington's office, or the office that he used while stationed at the mansion in the house. But by far, this piece of furniture, no one cares about Washington's office anymore. They just want to see the Lynn chair, as we refer to it. So on that note, I just want to say that I am fascinated and did not know about Jersey City. Does this mean that us as New Yorkers now have to be more respectful towards New Jersey?
Well, what's really interesting is he envisioned, and I think paraphrasing, but pretty much a direct quote, is that he envisioned that Jersey City would rise up on the other side of the bank to rival New York as a major center. And you see that today of how much these skyscrapers are going up. And I look over there and I say, you did it again, Hamilton, you got it right. Took a little bit longer since he passed away a few months later and the project didn't go as quickly, but every time I'm just like, his prescience is just so remarkable. Yeah.
And I think that's really important, especially for our younger viewers on here, to know that like one person really can make a difference. One person who's persevering, who has vision, and something I was really struck by, given the time frame that we are currently living in, was how you were saying that, he never really kind of stopped and enjoyed his successes in the moment. It was just like, all right, what's coming next? What's down the pike? He's in this constant state of pivoting. And I think that's something that we can all really relate to today. And it gives us hope, I think, listening to all of these stories.
Yeah. And when you're talking about, what young children or really any of us can take away from Hamilton, one of my favorite books, and actually we were really excited to partner with the Morris-Jumel Mansion a few years ago to have the author speak in the house, is a book called Alexander Hamilton's Guide to Life. And it's a fun, not irreverent, but just a very relaxed approach to biography / miniature essays. And, you can go in and just read one chapter and learn about not only Hamilton's life, but how can I come away inspired from it to apply to my own life? And I really like that approach because, we're really passionate about that. It's not just about learning about these historical figures, but how can we be better informed and inspired by them for ourselves today?
And take those lessons forward. I think that's the really
Exactly.
special thing about Guide to Life, is that it kind of takes a lot of Hamilton's maxims and helps us to apply them to today. And I don't know necessarily that all research gives you that bridge. How do we take it from the research and from the historic information to something that I can actively apply in my life today? So we are thrilled for all of you to be joining us, and we are going to do a raffle after this event and raffle off one of those books. So some lucky viewer in the audience will get a copy of Jeff Wilser's Guide to Life, and hopefully will come and visit the mansion sometime soon.
Absolutely. And I do just want to add, Meg, of how glad I am that you were adding such important information about Morris-Jumel Mansion itself and how it fits into all this history, because we're really passionate about bringing people to the sites and making sure they connect with the history. As you say, Lynn sitting in Aaron Burr's bedroom and having conversations with descendants of Aaron Burr, completely changed the direction that he was going in with the musical, and saw more of these individuals as real people, and how that affected the narrative of what he told in the musical. And so I just think it speaks to the power of going to these sites and really truly understanding why it's important to be there physically if you can. It's so wonderful to connect with so many people online, but we always encourage people to visit. Another really wonderful book is, and it relates to both the musical and historic sites, is by Brian Barreras, called Where Was the Room Where It Happened? And so it helps people learn about all these sites, how you can easily visit. And so, I just really love that too. And so I just encourage everyone to get out and experience history where they can, when they can.
Yeah, and we are very close to the Grange, so you can visit both the Grange and the Morris-Jumel Mansion all in one day. And if you're interested, you can always reach out to us and send us an email and let us know you're coming and that you're interested in Hamilton. We are always thrilled to welcome our Hamilton fans into the house. And kind of what you were saying about conveying the stories of, or the narratives of historic figures, Aaron Burr also lived in Morris-Jumel Mansion about a little bit more than 30 years after the duel. And we really try and talk about both Hamilton, Washington, Burr, every historic figure who came into the house, and, from a real humanistic perspective. Like, these were not flawless marble statues of men. They had impulses, they held grudges. There was, as you were saying, it was not a peaceful time by any means. And I think that is, again, it gives us hope for some of what we're seeing today.
Exactly.
I do see Nolan has a hand up to ask a question. Let's see, are we able to? Presley, are
Hi,
you?
Nolan.
I can't. Nolan, is that a wave or a question? And maybe Nolan just waving hello. And if anyone else has
Okay, I guess I'm unmuted now.
Great.
Now you're in
Wonderful.
trouble. It's been a privilege and an honor and a pleasure to know Nicole and the late great Father Rand in 2011, when there were about 8 people in the Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society. It's been a pleasure, a privilege, and an honor to speak dozens, if not hundreds of times on Hamilton. At the time of the play, maybe 200 people at a time, now more like 20 people at a time. But I want to get in this because I feel compelled as I get more and more experienced. I say this every time now during my 1-hour talk. If you don't remember anything else I say about Alexander Hamilton, remember this. I'm going to refer to the Federalist Papers. The Philadelphia document we now call the Constitution, Patrick Henry called Philadelphia toilet paper, and that was just being polite. If 9 of the 13 nation states did not ratify this Philadelphia toilet paper, it was meaningless. So Hamilton, as you well said in your great presentations, put together the whole project. Federalist number 15, why are governments constituted at all? That is the question of all questions. Why are governments constituted at all? Because, Hamilton, the passions of men will not conform to the dictates of reason and justice without constraint. We are not rational animals. We are not capable of self-government. This doesn't make you popular, but it is human nature. So that's why we are a government of laws, not a government of men. Of all the great contributions Hamilton made, this may be the greatest. We are a government of laws. Everyone swears loyalty to the Constitution. Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. The president has to say it, the vice president, every senator, every congressman, everyone in the military, every single federal officer. So I just wanted to throw that out there as just an exclamation point, a little spice on top of this incredible meal that Nicole and Sergio have served us.
Thank you
So much, Nolan, for sharing that. And I wanted to add something to something that you said, not on the center of what you just shared, but you mentioned how you mentioned the word meaningless. And I want to get a little bit into that word because many historians refer to the adoption and the ratification of the United States Constitution as the Second American Revolution. And that makes a lot of sense because if that didn't happen, the first American Revolution would have been meaningless. So thank you so much for sharing what you did.
So can you both tell us how our audience can get more involved with your organization and take their fandom to a new level?
Absolutely. Well, we do thank you all for joining us today to learn more about Hamilton, and hope that no matter what you knew about him, maybe there was something new that you learned today, but we'd love to have you stay connected with us. We do programming throughout the year, and we also do a lot of special initiatives. And so we'd love for you to join us. Our website is theahasociety.org. You can also find us on social media at the AHA Society. Sergio, would you like to tell about, for example, one of our major initiatives that we just did with the Hamilton statue, just as an example of the kinds of programs that we're always looking to do and add to the historical space?
Absolutely. Following the discoveries of Michael E. Newton about Alexander Hamilton, not only spending time in St. Croix and Nevis, but also in the island of St. Eustatius, the AHA Society board took a trip to Nevis to reinforce our relationships and our commitment to work with them as friends of the Alexander Hamilton Birthplace Museum. And one of the things that came out of that trip was the concept of the Hamilton Triangle, the need to unite those three islands for historic preservation and history tourism. And also the project of having a statue of Alexander Hamilton in the Caribbean. Now, this statue was unveiled last year, and it's the one that we can see right there. On the museum grounds, we did not put a statue on public lands or in the city. We put it in the grounds of a museum. And this beautiful statue was made by the renowned sculptor Benjamin Victor, who, if you have not heard about him, please look him up. Extraordinary artist. This is hopefully the first of 3 statues that we plan to put in the Caribbean, and there were so many people involved in the success of this endeavor that we cannot mention them all by name right now, but it is just look at that beautiful statue down there.
And we just dedicated this past week as part of our Happy Birthday Hamilton program. Half of our board was able to travel down to the site for the annual Hamilton birthday tea that raises funds for local Nevisian school children. And we dedicated some informational plaques to accompany the statue. So always looking to do great things like that. And so we'd love to have you as members to support projects like this and really just stay connected. And if you want to get involved, we'd love to hear from you as well.
Well, thank you everyone for your time. Wonderful questions, great comments tonight. I do just want to read aloud. Eric mentioned, and I thought this was a really great way to phrase it. Ratification was the nation's puberty or growing up, whereas declaration was the birth. And I think that's a nice way to kind of end this program and acknowledge that we are constantly evolving and growing, and the seeds that Hamilton planted are still blossoming around us every day. And we are so grateful. You guys are just like absolutely brilliant and so articulate and enthusiastic. It is an absolute pleasure to have you on with us. We look forward to doing more in-person stuff, perhaps around the anniversary of the duel this year. We love any partnerships that we have with you guys, and we look forward to many, many more. And yes, Eric, this is recorded and it will be live on both of our YouTube channels. And on that note, good night, everyone. Take care.
Thank you, everyone. Wonderful evening.